Hello, this is Monty Van Wert, your instructor. Today, I am pleased to say that we have a guest speaker of international renown, Professor Gert Bouckaert. Professor Bouckaert is from KU Leuven. KU Leuven was founded in 1425. It's one of the great universities of the world. He comes from the Institute of Public Governance, and we have been working with Professor Bouckaert in my department, I personally, for many years, so it's a revered relationship. There are three areas in which he has particular expertise. One of those is performance management. The second one is financial management, and the third is public management reform. Of course, today that's the topic he'll be focusing on, in particular from an HR perspective. Before I go any further, I should mention that there is a PowerPoint that goes along with this, so if you don't have that PowerPoint, do make sure that you stop the video, you perhaps print out or pull up the video or the PowerPoint so that you can be following along on the PowerPoint as we go through the guest lecture. And so now I will turn it over to Professor Bouckaert and thank him very much for presenting a perspective on change in HR which is broader than the one we looked at, Professor Light's, which is more administrative and micro level. This is more of a macro level, and I think you'll find it very rewarding. So, Professor Bouckaert.
Hello, I'm very pleased to be amongst you and to share some of my ideas on public sector reform and the interface with human resources. There are actually two ways to look at this. One could say human resources is the start and that impacts reform. One could also say the starting position is the general reform initiative and the programs and how that has impacted human resources. But before we start, and now we move to the second page, we could actually summarize public sector reform. That's a bit of a challenge because many things happen in many countries. And so one of the issues is how can we summarize, synthesize, simplify, reduce the complexity of such a very complex setting of reforming the public sector. And actually up to the 2000 and 2005 perhaps, it would be useful, it would have been useful to summarize and using 4 M's. And the first M is maintain, the second M is modernize, the third M is marketize, and the fourth M is minimize. And they all have to do with how countries have approached the reform, what the major line of reform was. Some have actually predominantly maintained their basic systems, and I'm thinking of the Federal Republic of Germany, for example, and I think that's a model that's still there and is valuable. It means not that nothing has changed, it means that the basic premises of the system have been maintained. A second category of countries has actually focused on modernizing, meaning bringing in performance-driven instruments. And human resources obviously is part of that. It's the performance-driven human resources modernizations. I will come back to that. The third is marketize. It's not privatize, it's marketize. That means to put in the system market type mechanisms to bring in quasi-markets and actually to see how human resources are subject to this marketization. It's a bit of a tendering of competences and see how we could bring this in. The fourth system is minimize. That's a bit of a reductive story. It just means we cut parts of the public sector and we remove parts of this public sector into other sectors, predominantly the private sector. And of course this has a huge impact on human resources itself. It means that you have to hive off people and put them outside the system. We recently have a bit remodeled our sentences using 3 basic models. The first is a market-driven one, 2. It's the new public management synthesis, and that is combining some of these M's, combining, let's say, the marketize, minimize, and modernize formulas into one system. The second is the moving away from the classical bureaucracy, a Weberian system, to a neo-Weberian system. And I think you obviously understand that this also has an impact. This is a different type of human resources management in a neo-Weberian system compared to a new public management system. But we have to add a third type here, which is not part of these four M's. It's new public governance. And new public governance is driven by networks. And that means we have to have partnerships with NGOs, with the private sector. And I think, again, you can imagine that for the public sector and its human resources, it requires other competences and other ways of interacting with people, not just inside our organizations, but also emphasize interactions with the outside. The reaching out becomes important, the communication becomes important. And that's also what we will discuss. If we move to the third slide, the essence here is to say, talking about reform is not just one step of one solution, or rather one problem, one solution, and a one relationship between one problem and one solution. That's a bit too simple. Reality is much more complex. If we analyze reforms, we actually see that there is a kind of sequence. It means that a problem triggers solutions, but suddenly we are aware that this solution also triggers new problems. Now that's a very interesting thing. Why is it? I will come back to that later, but let me first start with the first set of problems that we have been coping with and that triggered the reforms of the last 20-30 years. And then we move to the next slide, page 4. There was a perceived, I emphasize, a perceived lack of performance by the organizations, but also by some of the personnel inside these organizations. And that was operationalized or let's say made more visible by telling or by concluding that organizations but also their civil service were not taking enough responsibility for performance, that they were not enough accountable for performance, that they were not enough transparent for performance, that the control systems were not always effective to push people to do what they had to do, and that obviously impacted the results of organizations. So if we agree with this kind of summary of problems, then the question is, what could be the solution and how has this been transformed the public sector? Well, the classical answer that we have observed in reality is that, and New Zealand was a champion in that, they said, we have the solution. We shall actually make our human resources more responsible for results. So the question was actually, which they tried to answer, how should we reorganize ourselves? How should we reorganize human resources to make sure that we have more responsible civil servants for performance? And that affects human resources. Agencies were created, and agencies were more autonomous, they were more specialized, they had more specialized competences, and they measured performance. And most people thought that's the solution, and so we can go to the party and we can actually stop the reforms. No, that was absolutely not the case. And we move to page 5. Why is it that solutions create new problems? Well, there are 3 reasons for that. It could be that actually we had the wrong solutions for the right problems. Perhaps we were copying the wrong solutions from other countries. But it could be that we had the right solutions for the right problems, and also then we see perhaps that the right solutions were badly implemented. So that's the second reason why a solution could become a problem. The third reason is that even if we have the right solutions and we have the correct implementation, it could be that solutions get disconnected from the problems. So as a consequence, we see that the solutions I just mentioned, these autonomous agencies, with a huge impact on human resources, namely their own personnel systems per agency, that created new problems. And these problems were dysfunctional autonomies, actually. And these dysfunctional autonomies created suboptimal outputs. So actually people in the human resources were too much focusing on outputs and not on outcomes. That was an immense disadvantage and created new problems. And so that resulted in having to trigger new solutions. And these new solutions, we are page 7, these new solutions were that we needed coordination mechanisms. We needed actually a kind of audit capacity. I think I will focus on this audit capacity. Auditors were the fastest booming type of civil servants in the public sector. So that had a huge impact on the structure of human resources itself in this cycle of auditing the performance of systems. And again, we thought that is a solution, the final solution. Oh no, this solution created new problems because we were aware that hierarchies became pure re-centralizations, markets turned into private monopolies, networks became symbolic and aesthetic. We got an audit tsunami ultimately. So these were all new problems. And the worst part here, we established distrust within the public sector. And as a consequence, we were forced, and next page is 9, we were forced to move to new solutions. And the new solutions, again, from a reform perspective, are to re-establish trust, to re-equilibrate control systems based on trust and based on performance, and to include the performance governance system. And again, this has a huge impact on the human resources way of organizing our public sector, because this performance governance as part of the solution implied that we have to work with partnerships to deliver public services, and that means partnerships with the private sector, with NGOs, and with other public sectors, because we should not underestimate the importance to have collaborations and partnerships within the public sector. Central government with local government, for example, is a crucial issue, and that has a huge impact on human resources. For example, the circulation of personnel from local government to central government, for central government to local government, from Ministry of Finance to line departments, from audit departments to line departments. And so all of that together, so the mobility of personnel becomes very important, but also to make sure that some of our human resources are, let's say, have internships in the private sector or at NGOs. Let me summarize. It is clear that reform can trigger human resources changes, but also that human resources is a key and a leverage for public reform, public sector reform in general. If we have the duty to solve problems and generate solutions, we should actually also anticipate that solutions generate new problems. And I think we need to be very careful there and have ex-ante evaluations to make sure we can anticipate the new problems we trigger by presenting new solutions. The second conclusion is we have to have a blend of market, hierarchy, and networks. And these are 3 different models to handle human resources. And a third conclusion is that trust and culture, they do matter if we want to take human resources seriously, if we want to take reform seriously. Reform needs human resources, human resources need public sector reform. Thank you very much.
And Professor Bouckaert, thank you very much.